Good morning and welcome to the program. My name is Chloe Tomlins. On today's show, we are going to be looking into old age and in particular the devastating illness that is dementia. For those of our listeners who are in young or mid-adulthood, have you ever considered what old age might encompass for you? Perhaps some of you might look at your own grandparents for ideas about growing old. Others might have friends in old age or workmates in old age, and still others may turn to older adults in their community, in the town that they live. All these observations are sure to affect how you think about old age. Why is it even necessary to think about old age? Well, 13% of Australia's population are aged 65 or over, and this number is growing at a substantial rate. More and more resources are required to take care of this demographic of the Australian public. Another important issue to consider is the various kinds of illnesses that can be experienced in old age. Dementia is one of the leading causes of death in Australia, and the incidence of the illness in our older population is expected to increase substantially by over 400% over the next 40 years in Australia. For this reason, we will be delving into dementia on today's program and taking a close look at Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia. So firstly, I would like to share my reasons for my interest in dementia. We'll then go on to discuss what dementia is, including some important and interesting aspects of the illness that I learnt from my research. And then I'll outline why it's important for consideration in working with older adults therapeutically today. My first real exposure to dementia in the form of Alzheimer's disease was visiting my grandmother in New Zealand who had the illness. I was 14 years old and I don't really remember much about the experience. What I do remember is my great-grandfather having to look after my great-grandmother as she slowly lost the ability to care for herself. It was not until a few years later, when I watched the film The Notebook, that I truly understood the severity and devastating effects of the disease. The film follows a husband's efforts to make his wife remember him and who she is and all about her life by reading to her about how they met and their life together. His wife had Alzheimer's disease. Watching the film again in my early 20s caused me to reflect on the possibility of myself or someone I love experiencing dementia in old age. And honestly, this prospect scared me. So in response to this, I felt it was important to discuss dementia, and in particular Alzheimer's disease, on today's program to promote awareness of the illness and to show those who have loved ones with the illness that they're not alone. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with dementia, it is an illness that affects the brain. It is a slow, progressive illness that can affect cognition, including attention, language and memory, among other things, and everyday behaviour, making normal functioning difficult. Sadly, it often leads to the older person not being able to take care of themselves anymore. There are various kinds of dementia, but Alzheimer's disease is the most common and well-known type. The onset of Alzheimer's disease is identified by the deterioration of the memory, as illustrated by difficulty with recall. This is caused by the degradation of certain brain cells found in the area of the brain associated with learning and memory. Behaviours characteristic of those with Alzheimer's disease include getting lost on their way home, even when they are in a familiar environment, forgetting where they put their keys, or forgetting events that happened the previous day. From this evidence, we can see how a person with this illness would slowly lose their ability to be able to look after themselves, especially when they're living alone. The first important aspect of the disease that I found in my research was related to detecting the onset of Alzheimer's disease and how different functions are impaired. These are known as the 6 A's of Alzheimer's disease. We will take a brief look at these now. So the first is amnesia, and this refers to forgetting recent events, which involves use of the short-term memory, which is impaired. The second is agnosia, which refers to difficulty in recognising objects, and this includes recognising faces. The next is aphasia, and this means having issues in naming certain objects. The next one is apraxia. So this is a physical impairment that makes physical things such as driving or using a mobile telephone very difficult for the older adult. Abstract reasoning also declines, which includes a loss of insight to their illness for the older adult. And finally, affect and behaviour are affected. The person becomes less sociable and apathetic in mood. Secondly, it's no doubt frustrating for doctors, psychologists, and people whose loved ones have the illness that there is no known cause or cure for dementia or Alzheimer's disease. As age is the primary risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, it's perfectly understandable that fear can build up in an older person due to the constant wondering whether or not they will get Alzheimer's disease or any other form of dementia. After all, you can't stop yourself from aging. This fear is very real and can lead to what's known as anticipatory dementia, which is exhibited by mistaking normal changes in memory due to normal aging for the onset of dementia. The disease is more commonly found in women, and there does not seem to be a genetic cause for late onset dementia or Alzheimer's disease. The third interesting and encouragingly positive aspect of the illness is that there are a few known ways to reduce the risk of getting Alzheimer's disease, in old age that is. These include being actively involved in social activities and engaging in regular physical and cognitive activity. This is an area where family members and friends can certainly help by way of encouraging the person to engage in these mentioned activities. For example, inviting them on regular outings with family or friends, visiting them to play games that encourage cognitive development or cognitive engagement. So now that we have more of an understanding of dementia and Alzheimer's disease and their effects, it's important to look at why this issue is important to consider in relation to therapeutic practice with older adults, specifically in psychology. So the first and perhaps most obvious reason was actually mentioned at the beginning of today's program. The percentage of older adults in Australia is steadily growing. With this growth, the prevalence of dementia is also growing at an alarming rate. For this reason, it's essential that the general public, and more importantly, health professionals, have a good, solid understanding of the disease and its symptoms, to better be able to diagnose and care for the older adults in our public who have the disease. A study done on undergraduate students in Hong Kong showed that students who had little knowledge of or exposure to dementia patients found their clinical practice with dementia patients very challenging. Their unfamiliarity with the illness was the primary cause for their difficulty. Alternatively, the students who had training in working with dementia patients and prior clinical practice with dementia patients had a more positive attitude towards the older adults who had dementia. The conclusion drawn from the results of the study was that by enhancing students' knowledge about dementia and increasing their training with dementia patients, their attitudes and awareness of dementia could be improved. The more health professionals, including and especially psychologists, there are specialising in this area, or at least having an extensive knowledge of the disease, the better equipped the healthcare system will be to cope with the growing number of older adults with dementia and Alzheimer's disease in the Australian public. As I've previously mentioned, the thought of possibly having Alzheimer's disease can be very traumatic for an older adult. So it is most beneficial for psychologists to be aware of this possible fear in order to be better equipped to assist their client in alleviating this fear should it arise. It is also important to have a sound knowledge of dementia in order to determine whether a client is truly experiencing the onset of dementia or if they're simply experiencing anticipatory dementia, as we mentioned earlier. In beginning to engage with and assess an older adult who is presenting with dementia in any form, I believe the primary goal would be to alleviate any fear that the client is experiencing in regards to their illness. It would be important to understand the client's definition of the disease, including how they think it will affect them and any impacts that this may have on their future. Eradicating any false beliefs and misconceptions about the disease or illness is imperative. This way, the older adult is free from the what-ifs and has a clear, true understanding about the nature of their illness. Once the older adult has been given a diagnosis with dementia, it would be most appropriate, in my opinion, to source a support person for the client, someone who can sit with them through their sessions if they desire, or at least someone who can be informed about their disease and its severity, and who can provide support to the older adult in their home environment. The most appropriate support person would ideally be a spouse, but if the older adult didn't have a spouse, then a technique known as mapping the system of relationships could be used. So in this technique, all the people involved in the older adult's life, in terms of who can help or provide support to the older adult, is included in a relationship map. Then from this, the psychologists can determine the appropriate person or people to be able to support the older adult through their diagnosis. In assessing the older adult, it would be important to ascertain the severity of the symptoms, and in particular which symptoms are being exhibited. In the case of Alzheimer's disease, I would look at the 6 A's of Alzheimer's disease that we discussed previously. Then to determine whether the older adult is exhibiting any of the symptoms in the 6 categories, a questionnaire could be developed that includes questions relating to these categories. Sensitivity would be the key here. It would be very important that the questions are worded in a non-judgmental, non-confrontational way to ensure that the older adult feels comfortable and especially valued, not as if they're being judged as losing their mind or any less intelligent as a result of their illness. Respect is essential. It is vital to act in the best interest of the client at all times during practice. Acting in the best interest of the older adult means ensuring they keep as much independence as possible despite their diagnosis. In the home environment, this means ensuring that the older person is able to decide on their own what they can and cannot do, and that they are only provided assistance by other health professionals or carers when absolutely necessary. This way, the older person keeps as much autonomy as possible without letting the illness take hold of their life. Well, that's all we have time for today. In conclusion, I would just like to emphasise that although old age is the primary risk factor for dementia, it certainly does not mean dementia is inevitable in old age. While it is beneficial to know the symptoms of the illness, it is important as an older adult not to let fear take hold of your freedom. So thank you for joining me on today's program, and please tune in again at the same time tomorrow.